welcome to Undercurrents, our daily news show from Unheard's Washington Bureau. Make sure to subscribe over at undercurrents.tv for a premium subscription. It's $1 for your first month, and you get all kinds of paywalled content. Please subscribe here to the YouTube channel and wherever you download your podcasts as well. We have some breaking news to go over right now. Claudia Sheinbaum, the president of Mexico, and Donald Trump, obviously the president here in the United States, have agreed to a 1-month pause on the 25% proposed tariff that Donald Trump was levying on Mexico. Now, what this means for Canada is much less clear. It could have some implications for Canada, but let's just start right here because it gives us this question about what the goal of Donald Trump's tariffs actually was. Donald Trump himself, I would argue, hasn't done a ton of favors in being specific about what the goal of these flat 25% tariffs actually is. What does he want to see from Canada, for example, that could be answered partially by what allowed him, or in his mind at least, allowed him to agree to this 1-month pause with Claudia Sheinbaum. That would be her decision to say she was putting 10,000 troops up to the Mexico-U.S. border to help secure the borders, to help secure with drug trafficking, essentially. And that's where I think this becomes really, I think some of the media coverage here is missing something really important in Trump's press release. You have to really, about the tariffs, that is to say, you have to read it very closely, which is of course what journalists should do to pick up on this. But let's go to we'll put this up on the screen. This is from whitehouse.gov. This is a fact sheet that Donald Trump's White House posted about the tariffs on imports from Canada, Mexico, and China. So in this, the reason I think he hasn't done himself a lot of favors for being super specific about what he wants to see, like let's say Canada wanted to stop this 25% tariff. What could they do to stop it or to mitigate it? I don't know that there's a ton that Donald Trump has said, or even in this fact sheet, that gives Canada some indication as to exactly what would have to happen. Because, for example, he says, until the crisis, this is the drug crisis, he says, addressing an emergency situation, the extraordinary threat posed by illegal aliens and drugs, including deadly fentanyl, constitutes a national emergency under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. This is crucial because it allows Donald Trump to do this without Congress. Now, it hasn't been used this drastically before. I mean, this is basically the most drastic implementation of tariffs in about 100 years. Like, you can go back to Smoot-Hawley, which obviously a lot of people associate with exacerbating the Great Depression, to find an example this dramatic. The president says that he has to, or we know that the president has to say that this is in response to an emergency in order to do it unilaterally as the executive. So that's where Trump is now saying until the crisis is alleviated, and that would be the crisis posed by, quote, illegal aliens and drugs, he has the authority, because this constitutes a national emergency, to implement these tariffs on imports from Canada and Mexico, and obviously the 10% tariff on China as well. So Mexico, it's pretty obvious that those 10,000 troops to the border, you can get at least a 1-month pause out of Donald Trump by that leverage. So I think it makes it clear that what Trump is trying to do is get them to the table on helping him with immigration enforcement, with an immigration crackdown. Makes a ton of sense from the perspective of Mexico. From Canada, though, what's interesting is that we've heard, both in the context of Mexico and Canada, but you see further down on this White House fact sheet and in Trump's own messaging on it, quote, there's a section here that says, using our leverage to ensure American safety. Previous administrations failed to fully leverage America's economic position as a tool to secure our borders against illegal migration and combat the scourge of fentanyl, preferring to let problems fester. Now, he then says, while trade accounts, and I shouldn't say him, this is from the White House, he says, while trade accounts for 67% of Canada's GDP, 73% of Mexico's GDP, and 37% of China's GDP, it accounts for only 24% of U.S. GDP. And he says tariffs are powerful, the White House says, proven source of leverage for protecting the national interest. So I think what you're seeing here is somewhat muddled messaging, because on the one hand, Trump needs to say that this is about drugs and migrants, illegal migrants, in order to have it fall under this umbrella power of the emergency act that he is implementing in order to go around Congress with these tariffs. So, on the one hand, that's where the messaging is coming from. On the other hand, if this is economic, and Donald Trump has made economic arguments for protectionist tariffs for a long time. I mean, if there is one thing that Donald Trump is ideologically committed to, basically, it is using tariffs as an economic tool to protect the national interest. He obviously says over and over again that America's jobs have been outsourced not just to faraway countries, but to our neighbors, Mexico and Canada. And you know what? There's truth to that. And there are people who say openly, economists who say, yes, that is true. They do say there are parts of the country that were hollowed out, but in the net, this was a positive for the United States. Now, if you look at, for example, if we're talking about this in economic terms, we get a huge chunk of like our cherry tomatoes from Canada. We get a huge chunk of gypsum. I think it's like 71% from Mexico. What percentage of farm work is done by Americans? It's actually like 56%. That is to say, more than half of the lowest level farm work, meaning entry level farm work, those quote unquote jobs Americans won't do, it's still like 56% of that is being done by American citizens. So that's I would say, like the intellectual backbone of the economic argument. But what's interesting in this messaging is that because Donald Trump has to say this is about fentanyl and migrants, to do it as under his powers and to not use Congress, it's, I think, kind of unclear exactly what he wants to see out of Canada on this. And it is true that some drugs come in through Canada and some migrants come in through Canada. And it is true that there's more that Canada can do. We've seen people in Canada say there's more that leaders in Canada say there's more that Canada can do. A 25% tariff will have dramatic implications for the Canadian economy, period. It hurts Canada a lot more than it hurts the United States, if you accept that it does hurt the United States. It's clear, even Trump put on a Truth Social post today, that it will cause quote unquote pain. And he says like it'll likely, or that we will likely see pain, maybe, I think is the word that he used. But that is a pretty good concession that this will have an effect on prices in the US. What it will do to the Canadian economy is much more dramatic. And already in reports, you can see people in Canada saying they're thinking about moving their businesses to the United States. We saw that happen with the first round of tariffs in Trump's earlier administration. Tariffs on China, by the way, that Joe Biden kept. So all this is to say, the economic argument is not at all as dumb as a lot of people in the media and on the left, and actually even on the right, who are super pro free trade and have been for decades. It is not as dumb as they make it out to be, but it also would certainly cause economic pain. There's basically no question about that. There is, though, a question of you have pretty close to, if not record high levels of labor force participation rate. Especially among men. Nicholas Eberstadt at the American Enterprise Institute has talked about this a lot. You have, for decades, we have seen the number of men who are just out of the labor force inching up and up. So it's not about the unemployment rate, although that obviously is relevant too, but the labor force participation rate, you see the total going down, and the people who are out of the workforce over the years, that's going up and up. Able-bodied workers who are out of the workforce going up and up. And so, to some extent, it's like there's a lot of untapped, like this accounts for like 6 million men, able-bodied men, somewhere around there, Nick Eberstadt estimates, so, and others. So there's a lot of untapped potential in the American workforce. And when you see, obviously, certain jobs going away or going to people who have temporary permits or who aren't permitted to work, or their status is sort of shaky and we don't know exactly how long they'll be here for because of laws and all of that, what changes with administrations, what changes through the courts. There is a lot of untapped power in the American labor force. So would Donald Trump or a Republican Congress do anything to incentivize that, to shift the incentive structure? If you don't, you could end up, worsening the situation, and the experiment is just a ton of people still prefer to stay out of the labor force, and they don't do these jobs because there are so many incentives to stay out of the labor force. So, I mean, Republicans should be thinking pretty hard about coupling, if this is in some ways seen as an economic tool, especially where Canada is concerned. They should be thinking about how to incentivize labor force participation among able-bodied people who have chosen to leave. And obviously, bringing jobs back and more jobs to the United States is a good start. But there are a lot of incentives for people to just stay out of the workforce. So Republicans should think very clearly about shifting that incentive structure, coupling this with a shift in those incentive structures. But Trump himself, I think, I mean, he with Scheinbaum, it makes a lot of sense what he wants to see. From Canada, I'm much more curious what would appease Donald Trump, if anything, on that. And this is the point where I want to turn to Orrin Cass, somebody from American Compass, somebody who I read very closely when all of this happens. His I guess suggestion or his guidance, I think, is really helpful here. He says these are negotiating tariffs, and that is clear from the White House fact sheet, actually, that we just read, announcing the tariffs, which frames the policy as, quote, addressing an emergency situation and, quote, using our leverage. Nothing in the document, says Orrin, indicates an economic focus. The ongoing negotiations over whether they will even take effect confirm the strategy. But then Orrin continues, unsurprisingly, the policy design itself is ill-suited to economic objectives, but well-tailored to a negotiating posture. No effort has been made to allow for preparation, create certainty, or support investment in domestic supply. The gentler treatment of China versus Mexico and Canada may also be telling. China is the proper target for decoupling, so why is the threatened tariff on China lower? And, Orrin talks about the de minimis exception, which Trump mostly closed. With his tariffs on China. But finally, what Orrin is saying is that this is a goal, or the ultimate goal of Trump in this negotiating tariff imposition is sort of understanding that the global order is shifting, that the post-Cold War geopolitical order that everyone has become used to is shifting. And rather than becoming sort of the benevolent or remaining the benevolent global hegemon, the United States is saying, this is about putting our interests first, not the world's interests first, but our interests first. And what Donald Trump is doing is trying to induce that shift in a way that works for the United States and to come to these negotiations in a way that works for the United States. That's sort of ultimately what Orrin suggests is the goal. And I think that's very persuasive. He writes, we are not going to take it upon ourselves to bear burdens for everybody else anymore. Other countries are going to have to start working from different assumptions and anticipating different challenges and trade-offs. You can still be very good friends and allies with a country that's pursuing its own interests first, but you have to recognize and respect that what those interests are, and think about a relationship that proceeds accordingly. And before that, Orrin wrote, for several decades, everyone has assumed the U.S. will operate on the world stage with both arms tied behind its back in this magnanimous way, premised on a belief that promoting the liberal world order will ultimately work out best for everybody, the U.S. included. And then finally, Orrin ends on saying, the idea of imposing tariffs on Canada and Mexico, and indeed on all nations, is not nearly as strange as it seems at first to analysts steeped in the post-Cold War mindset that calls for free trade even with China. Sometimes the board must be flipped, but we should do so in a way that avoids losing any pieces and with a clear idea of how we intend to set them back up. I do think that is very, very, very important. And Orrin adds at another stage in this essay that Trump's message on Truth Social Sunday morning was all caps. This will be the golden age of America. Will there be some pain? Yes, maybe. Orrin says this is exactly the right message to deliver, but this particular set of tariffs is a poor one to accompany that delivery. Tariffs that impose large costs immediately without the likelihood of delivering economic upside are more likely to leave free traders saying, told you so, and Americans souring on the entire project. Now, when media would go out and talk to farmers in the Midwest, soybean farmers, for example, who were being hit hard by tariffs in Trump's first administration, people would sort of the media would sort of be surprised by what they heard. People would be like, you know what? We know that the system is out of whack, and we're willing to trust Donald Trump to sort of readjust, the entire economy in the agriculture sector. I think to Orrin's point, what we should be considering now is that these are not designed to have a similar effect. So if these tariffs on Canada go into effect, Trudeau doesn't come to the table, Canadians don't come to the table with anything that pleases Trump, they go into effect, that it's not exactly going to be the same situation where you have farmers being like, okay, we are waiting out the adjustment and deferring to Donald Trump because these aren't designed in exactly the same way. They're designed for negotiations, and if Trump doesn't get negotiations out of Canada, which seems to be digging its heels in, the pain in the U.S. could hit differently. I think there's something to that, and that's why I think it's useful to read Oren, somebody who does actually believe that there's room for smart tariffs here, as a negotiation on fentanyl and migrants. I'm curious to see what Donald Trump would extract out of Canada that would mitigate this, if anything. So that's really what to watch going forward. What else he can get of Claudia Scheinbaum? They've already gotten quite a lot out of Claudia Scheinbaum, but there's way more to go. So we'll keep an eye on that, of course. Here, this is such a complicated subject because Trump is like actually a hardened ideologue on protectionism. So he does really believe in it, and there are significant problems with trade. There are significant problems with the border, but even sort of protectionists concede that for a president who ran on lowering prices and the economy, as Donald Trump really did, an immigration crackdown, even if it's entirely justified, and these tariffs, even if they're entirely justified, probably will have some pain for the American public. And then it's incumbent on Donald Trump to provide an off ramp and an explanation. And so that's what to watch going forward. And we'll be watching it here at Undercurrents. Thank you so much for tuning in. Make sure to subscribe, and we'll see you back here with more soon.